timely and important topic. Reliability and resilience might sound similar in concept, but obviously they're very different. And today we're going to dig into what actually sets those two concepts apart, how each are defined, how we measure them, and why those differences matter. So over the next hour, our expert presenters are going to walk through the key definitions and distinctions, traditional and emerging performance metrics, the visual tools for interpreting interruption data, and we'll look at some of the tools, data that utilities and states are using to make sense of power interruptions and how they're using that information in their planning to assess risks and prioritize support for critical infrastructure and vulnerable populations. We hope this session will offer valuable takeaways for your work. And without further ado, let me introduce the two experts. The fortunate thing for you all is I'm not going to be talking about any of this stuff. We've brought in two experts that actually know about this. The first that I'd like to introduce is Paul DiMartini. Paul is a leading expert on the business, policy, and technology dimensions of a more distributed and resilient power system. Over the past decade, he has led the development of integrated grid planning practices, DER utilization for distribution grid services, and microgrid tariffs and programs. He supported integrated distribution planning and grid modernization rate cases with over 20 utilities and 25 regulatory commissions. Earlier, Paul was a T&D vice president at Southern California Edison and a member of the National Academies of Sciences Transmission and Distribution Reliability Committee. He started his career at PG&E in electric system operations and T&D engineering and construction. Paul is a senior member of the IEEE and a California State Certified Electric System Operator. Our second presenter, who is actually going to go first today, is Miles Collins. He is an energy researcher at Berkeley's Lab for Energy Markets and Policy Development. He conducts research on resilience planning, valuation, and cost-benefit analysis for innovative utility programs. He's got 17 years of experience in energy policy, strategy, and analytics, including 13 years in the utility industry. He has served as the Energy Services and Utility Rates Manager at Burbank Water and Power, a principal consultant at Nexent, now Resource Innovations, and a manager of customer service business planning at Southern California Edison. He holds a PhD in policy analysis from the Rand Graduate School, a Master of Public Policy from UCLA, and a Bachelor's in Science in Environmental Engineering from Northwestern University. So now you understand why I said these guys are the experts. We want to thank both of them for being part of this today and remind you as the audience to drop your questions in the chat, Q&A chat at any time, and we will take those towards the end of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Collins to take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks to Nayruk for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. If we could move to the next slide. Again, my name is Miles Collins. I'm going to be starting out in our discussion of reliability and resilience with some definitions, metrics, and data. And then Paul will speak more about the planning process for reliability and resilience. Next slide, please. So starting out with definitions, for reliability, citing the definition here from the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, which is the ability to maintain the delivery of electric services to customers in the face of routine uncertainty in operating conditions. It can refer to two key elements. First, the bulk power system, or does the system have adequate generation and transmission resources to meet demand under normal and expected peak conditions? So here we're looking at resource adequacy, which has its own set of planning processes and metrics. That second element is reliability of the distribution system, or is the system delivering electricity in sufficient quantities and of sufficient quality to meet electricity users' needs? In our webinar today, we'll focus on the second element, or the distribution system reliability, and this accounts for 90 to 95% of customer interruptions. On the resilient side, this is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions, including the ability to withstand and recover from deliberate attacks, accidents, or natural occurring threats or incidents. So there's a number of different definitions in the literature and in use by states and utilities, but they generally cover the same types of concepts as you see here in this definition. You can be resilient to a number of types of disruptions, and these could be extreme weather events, earthquakes and tsunamis, or human attacks, so whether cyber or physical. So broadly speaking, reliability refers to normal conditions and foreseeable stress, while resilience looks at impacts from the high impact, lower frequency events, though these types of events are getting more and more frequent. Next slide, please. So measuring reliability indices are defined by IEEE standard 1366. This was first developed in 1998 and updated in 2003, 2012, and then most recently in 2022. These indices are normally calculated and reported annually, though they could be at different time frames. In contrast, resilience metrics tend to focus on specific events. The big indices, which I'll go through these here, SAFE, SAIDI, and CAIDI. And just a quick review of these ones. These are system average indices. So SAFE, the F stands for frequency. So we're looking at the total number of interruptions an average customer would experience within the year. SAIDI, the D stands for duration, so it's the time that an average customer is without power over some time period. And then for CAIDI, C is for customer. This is the average time required to restore service, so about the average duration of an outage or an interruption. And then MAFE, M stands for momentary. This is an interruption less than 5 minutes. So that's a distinction. An interruption that's sustained is 5 minutes or more, and then a momentary interruption is less than 5 minutes. Some information that's not apparent when only looking at these system averages is things like the portion of customers experiencing multiple interruptions or longer duration interruptions. So the remaining metrics on this table get at that information. So CEMI or SEMI. So these are it's the ratio of customers experiencing multiple interruptions, and then CEMM, same thing, ratio experiencing multiple momentaries. That third one, the CEM SMI, is the ratio, but we're combining the momentary and sustained. And then at the bottom, we have CLID, and there's two flavors of this. There's S and T. So this is looking at customers, the ratio of customers experiencing these long interruption durations. For S, it would be the ratio experiencing that a single interruption of a particular duration. For T would be the total time that a customer has been interrupted. All right, next slide, please. So how do we determine the normal operating conditions and which data to include in the reliability indices? So this gets at the concept of a major event day, or MED, and this was first developed in the 2003 update of the IEEE standard. So without a way to segment MEDs, you have indices that are heavily impacted by weather fluctuations. So with all those fluctuations, you don't have a great way of benchmarking against other utilities and comparing performance under those normal conditions. When we look at a distribution of interruption data, we see data like that's in this illustrative figure here on the right. So we would have daily SAIDI on the bottom, and this is a distribution that is not symmetrical like a normal distribution. It has a minimum of 0 there on the left, with a bunch of data clustered around the short interruption durations. And then we have a long tail to the right where the interruptions are longer and less frequent. The process of identifying that MED threshold would be we want to transform this data into a normal distribution by taking the natural log. Once we do this, we can perform some calculations to set a statistical threshold designed to capture a certain portion of the most extreme conditions on the far end of the tail. This portion is set at 2.5 standard deviations from that log mean. And at this threshold, we would expect 2.3 major event days per year on average. So you say, why do we say 2.5 standard deviations? It was based on consensus reached among IEEE distribution reliability working group members on the appropriate number of days that should be classified as MEDs. So there's judgment involved in setting that threshold. Next slide, please. So we'll just take, in the next couple of slides, look through at what this data looks like. This shows daily SAIDI data for 5 years between 2011 and 2015 for a utility. It's chronological, so it goes by date there on the bottom over that 5-year period, and then on the y-axis we see daily SAIDI in hours. We can see most of the data. There's 1,800 over 1,800 points. And most of that data has lines that are pretty low, but we do see some tall spikes there where the average customer was without power for a number of hours during that day. But these are relatively infrequent. Next slide. For finding that threshold, we would reorder that data into histogram. We see there that same data on the left. We see that bunch of data that's clustered over toward the left around the shorter durations with a tail stretching to the right. And then we take the natural log, as I mentioned, of each daily SAIDI value in the data set, and we see that on the right. And that looks more like that normal distribution. So once we find that normal distribution, we find the average of the logarithms. We find the standard deviation of the logarithms, and then we compute TMED, or the threshold, using the formula e to the mean plus 2.5 standard deviations. We get a TMED of 3.4, so meaning that any day with a daily SAIDI greater than that threshold value would be classified as an MED. And so if you go to the next slide there, we see for that following year, 2016, we have that threshold set at 3.4, and we've identified 4 MEDs, which we would remove from the data when we're calculating those reliability indices. Next slide. This slide shows that impact of removing MEDs from SAIDI and SAIFI data. So in the upper 2 graphs there, we have SAIDI, so that's the average duration, and in the lower 2 graphs we have SAIFI, so average frequency. On the left we have the data without MEDs removed. So and on the right we have it when it is removed. So we see those large fluctuations year by year between 2000 and 2012 for the SETI utilities, and we can see that variability is reduced, and this allows utilities to get a more apples to apples comparison of normal operating conditions, which they can use for benchmarking purposes and fit utilities into quartiles. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving into resilience. So this slide depicts a common visual representation of resilience. This slide has a version of this graphic from the literature on the left, and then one from an actual utility resilience plan on the right. What it shows is some characterization. They're illustrative, but they show characterization of system performance on the y-axis and then time on the x-axis. And it walks through what would be a resilience event from left to right. So there's the planning and preparation, withstanding phases on the left there. We see a dip down in the line where there's a degradation of system performance. This is when the event occurs. There's a disruption. This system would absorb some of the disruption, and then over time it would recover until it's back at its baseline level of performance, and then over time there would be some advancing or adapting, depending on which graph we're looking at, for improving that baseline level of resilience. This is commonly referred to as the resilience trapezoid. And as utilities and states are looking to improve resilience, they can look to improve resilience along each of these different phases. And so, like I mentioned earlier, the definition of resilience could differ depending on state or utility. And the phases there that you see at the bottom also differ based on state or utility, but they tend to align with those definitions. So on the left there we have plan, absorb, recover, and adapt. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at how well these investments mitigate or how well they perform, we're looking at what are referred to as performance metrics. So these metrics describe the effectiveness of resilience investments by quantifying the extent to which they have or have not reduced the negative impacts of these resilience events. Utility resilience measures seek to avoid some or all of these negative impacts that would have occurred without the measures. And this can help measure the progress toward achieving these objectives. This table shows examples of metrics for a few different categories there, categories listed on the left. So we have electrical service, restoration, asset damage or failure, and then some custom indices. Just going briefly through this table, for electrical service, we have customer interruptions, customer minutes interrupted, which are customer minutes interrupted is the sum of all customer minutes interrupted over a given time period. These two metrics are really the kind of the building blocks of some of the indices that I covered earlier, SAIDI, SAIFI. But you can get granular and look at it specifically, how many customer minutes were interrupted in a particular location in particular conditions. And then targeted reliability indices. So utilities do use SAIDI, SAIFI, SEMI, but for resilience, they will tend to look specifically at particular times, circuits, weather conditions, and causes. So key dimensions of granularity, you see some of these on the right there. We would be looking at making sure we're looking at a metric for a particular time period. You could look at certain interruption causes. So IEEE standard 1782-2022 there has a structured approach for being able to put interruptions in the proper cause categories so you can have consistent reporting and analysis. You would want to know where the location the interruption occurred, so circuit, substation, or other location, and then conditions too. So apart from the MED classification that we just went over, certain states have major storm classifications where there's a certain percentage of customers without power, or weather conditions, red flag warning, which is in the West where you have conditions with high fire risk, and then high wind warnings as well. Moving down the table, so for restoration metrics, we have those that are focused on time to restore, whether it's from the beginning of an outage to when a certain percentage of customers are restored, or that second one there, National Grid, as a metric where you're looking at the time from peak interruption to 95% restoration. You can also look at metrics that look at how long it takes the percent of customers restored within a certain number of hours, where X could vary for a major storm. Asset damage or failure, we're looking at the performance of the assets during the event, and then the custom indices there are metrics that may combine certain components, and it's more useful for ranking performance of resilience measures. Next slide. Other performance metrics get at monetary impacts. So this covers three categories here. We see utility costs in the first category, and these could be capital costs, or these could be O&M, or operations and maintenance, from restoration. So it covers the impact of damage from these events. as well as the O&M from restoration activities. A second category is customer interruption costs. So these are those incurred by customers experiencing a power interruption. So Berkeley Lab has a tool called the ICE calculator. It's used by a number of utilities across the US, and this aggregates customer interruption cost studies that have been conducted across the country and provides estimates of costs for interruptions shorter than 24 hours. These interruption cost studies are conducted by surveying residential, commercial, and industrial customers to determine the costs they incur. And this could be used to measure the value of improving reliability or just eliminating outages or avoiding outages that are 24 hours or less. For widespread longer duration interruptions lasting more than 24 hours, we start seeing spillover effects where, for example, an interruption to a manufacturing facility would impact all the customers of that facility who wouldn't be receiving the goods it would produce. Survey data, it's hard to estimate these kinds of impacts with the survey. For these types of interruptions, we can rely on macroeconomic models of a local economy. So one example of this type of model is a prototype power outage economics tool, or POET, and this is developed and piloted by Berkeley Lab and partners, including Commonwealth Edison in Illinois. So it uses a hybrid valuation approach with interruption cost surveys to collect information on household and business customer behavior, and then uses the data to calibrate a macroeconomic model of the regional economy. So if you click forward on the slide, a bar chart should appear here on the right, and this shows in ComEd service territory changes to gross domestic product for interruptions lasting 1 day, which is in green, so the shorter bars, 3 days, which is in yellow, and then a 14-day outage in red. Next slide, please. Performance metrics can have specific targets in the context of resilience. So for all the measures that we are looking at, in particular the interruptions and restoration, we can look at critical facilities. So infrastructure, which is essential for health, safety, and economic well-being. This could be hospitals, fire stations, emergency operation centers. So looking at this critical infrastructure and what the interruption metrics are for those for circuits that have those. Public safety power shutoffs. So this is where utilities will intentionally de-energize portions of the grid to reduce the risk of a wildfire caused by a utility asset. You see there in the upper right-hand corner, it's a graphic from SDG&E's wildfire mitigation plan. So it's looking at frequently de-energized circuits. You can see performance metrics finally for certain subsections of the population. So distributional impacts on the bottom right there, this is access and functional needs customers in SDG&E service territory. So customers that may be more vulnerable to impacts of prolonged outages. Next slide. And finally, things to consider when developing and applying performance metrics. For SAIDI and SAIFI, you see some utilities that report all-weather SAIDI and SAIFI. So these are this includes MEDs as measures of resilience, and it's just needing to exercise caution as these can be significantly impacted by frequency and intensity of weather events. So you could have the same level of resilience, but that metric can go up and down based on the number of extreme events that occur that year. For indices that combine and weight multiple components, they're useful for ranking and prioritizing, but maybe less useful for understanding specific impacts of measures as you lose information in the aggregation process. Combinations of metrics, more informative than just the standalone metrics, as they can give a more comprehensive view of the impacts of resilience investments. So apart from just having an average across the system, this kind of metric can perhaps mask how the frequencies and durations are distributed across the population. So looking at multiple metrics to get a better sense of performance. And then finally, making sure to understand the interplay and the trade-offs between metrics in the context of resilience improvement. So if you have if you're reducing frequency of shorter duration interruptions, you can actually decrease satiety, but you would have an increase in the average interruption duration. And then, for fire risk mitigation, if you have safety adjusted protection settings, that can you can have more resilience, but perhaps your reliability indices decrease. And with that, I will just leave you here with these additional resources are here in the presentation. Several reports on and tools on state requirements, data and analyses for distribution system planning, and also on resilience planning. And then finally, at the bottom, a link to the interruption cost estimate calculator, which has just been updated with new survey data with a broader coverage of the United States. So it's the new ICE Calculator 2.0. And with that, I will pass it along to Paul.
And Miles, thank you very much. Reminder to the folks that are watching, if you got questions, go ahead and type those into the Q&A, and we will get to those towards the end. Paul, take it away.
Thank you. Apologize, for some reason my camera just stopped. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts on how we integrate reliability and resilience into distribution system planning. Next slide, please. So the takeaway on this slide is that resilience planning and reliability are a major factor in the capital expenditure growth that's been underway across the U.S. As you can see here, highlighted through EEI's latest reports, the adaptation, hardening, and resilience expenditures are roughly 37% of utility distribution spending. And it's been growing, as you'll see in the chart there on the right-hand side from Berkeley Labs' most recent paper looking at rising rates and the costs of distribution expenditures, which are roughly now 44% of overall capital expense. While we tend to focus a lot sometimes in distribution planning around capacity expansion or load growth, really, as you can see there, 65% of the expenditures are really related to reliability and resilience. Replacement there is the asset management, and I'll touch on this, but asset management, looking at replacing aging infrastructure, is a primary contributor to reliability issues that underlying. So I'll be talking about how that gets folded into the analysis for both resilience and reliability. The other thing to note here is, as some of you are probably well aware, there's a fair amount of undergrounding that's been expanding over the past decade, and really for the last 20 years has doubled in terms of its percentage. And part of that has to do with resilience planning, both in those wildfire areas that are susceptible to wildfire ignition risk from utility overhead lines, as well as in other areas where hurricanes or even tornadoes, where undergrounding can provide greater resilience. All of this is part of an integrated distribution system planning approach that we've been working on and working with many of you on over the past decade. Next slide, please. And that's what I'm going to talk about is how we're going to how we incorporate that both asset management as part of the current system and assessment, as well as the resilience and reliability analyses, building on what Miles had shared earlier. Next slide, please. So as we dig in, the first thing we look at from a planning standpoint is asset management, and this involves a couple of steps. The first is to look at and assess your current state of the assets in terms of their condition, the age of the equipment, any potential issues that may exist. And as part of that, we start looking at operational performance. So how has the system performed since the last plan? That's an important aspect. We also look at historical trends and also in the context of reliability standards. It's also At the same time, we're assessing against codes and standards that may be applicable. For example, in many states there and nationally, there are standards in terms of utility pole condition and being able to do those inspections and other equipment inspections, and how those performance and current conditions have been trending to be able to start doing assessment of potential failures of that equipment. The other thing that's done is, at this point, is looking at performance benchmarking. So in addition to the SAIDI and CAIDI and metrics that Miles was discussing, which is done as part of the operational performance assessment, is we also start looking at peer benchmarking. So looking at how a utility is performing relative to a peer group that has a similar geographic and customer base, to be able to understand the implications of relative performance based on a number of factors. So performance benchmarking, and we think about this in terms of quartiles, as you're probably familiar. So first quartile is the best, fourth quartile is very poor. Typically, a good performing utility tends to be in second quartile, and there's often discussions as to whether that's sufficient or there's a need to migrate to and improve the system up to first quartile. But clearly, usually below second quartile, third quartile, fourth quartile, there's definitely opportunities to improve, and typically there's actions taken to improve to get to minimally second quartile performance. One of the things that's important here is that this asset management really is the foundational analysis that then feeds into both the resilience planning and reliability planning in terms of assessing the next steps and identifying specific needs that need to be addressed. Next slide, please. So as we start to understand where we've got issues on the system, or we've got specific feeders that are, based on the metrics that Miles shared with you, we start to look at a little deeper on worst performing circuits analysis. And this is an analysis to really look at and unpack those metrics, to start looking at which are the feeders that are or equipment that is really driving the issues that are creating the most interruptions and the impact on customers. And as part of this analysis, this is an important dimension to really look at that, to start identifying where to prioritize where the improvements would be. There's another step which we're going to talk about next, which has to do with doing root cause analysis. But this worst performing circuits is an important dimension to look at and really understand, because in many cases, a subset of circuits that are really driving, more often than not, the SAIDI and CAIDI, or the metrics, the poor performance that you may be seeing in terms of reliability. And often, in many states, there are a set of criteria in terms of what the utility needs to report in terms of worst performing circuits in a particular year as part of their annual reporting. Next slide, please. And here, what we're showing is an example from San Diego Gas and Electric in terms of their report on the 10 circuits that have the highest SAIDI, and there's also a similar worst performing list based on the other metrics. And so this is reported annually. This is pretty typical. In this case, it's 1%, but in other states, it's anywhere from 1 to 8%, or sometimes 10% of the circuits, depending on the nature of the number of circuits that a utility might have. So this is it's a way to start looking at which circuits are really creating the issues that need to be addressed, as a priority as part of the planning process. Next slide, please. So as I said, once we understand these circuits, but not just the individual circuits, but often there might be broader set of issues that start to be identified when you do the asset assessment in terms of what the equipment and what we're looking at and seeing in terms of inspections. And that has to do with looking at root cause analysis. that would be causing poor reliability. This root cause analysis identifies the underlying reasons for the failures. So we look specifically at what the issue is. It could be a piece of equipment, could be that's driving operational failures, could be a process as well. This tends to be, often we can see things that, it can range in terms of what the issues are. So, for example, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there were issues with a certain cable that was produced from a manufacturer that we used in underground distribution that had premature failure. It was supposed to last 40 years and it started failing at 20 years. And utilities were realizing that had bought this cable that it was a systemic issue and they were going to have to replace all this cable prematurely because it was causing a lot of outages. In other cases, you have equipment that basically reaches end of life, even at the very end of its life, and you need transformers, for example, or the like. Also, some things that are seem kind of maybe not as technical, but have to do with squirrels or other animals getting into equipment in particular areas, and then having to think about ways to guard the equipment from animals and birds and the like that otherwise would be causing some outages. The other is you might see poles that are in a place on a highway or a country road that happen to be on a curve that repeatedly get hit. And so you need to think about how to relocate it. You can have any number of these kind of issues that come up and might create some systemic issues that need to be addressed in terms of operational failure. It isn't always sort of storms and the like that may cause these reliability issues. So as we look at these data and the incidents, and in particular, if we're talking about systemic issues, those become issues because obviously those could be larger scale and may require, like in the case of the underground cable, a fairly long program to replace all of that may create pretty significant reliability issues. The other thing that you all are quite familiar with, I'm sure, is vegetation management, and that's always something that is a factor when we start looking at these reliability issues, in addition to resilience, but also from a reliability standpoint as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of reliability best practices, as Miles noted, looking at the standards under, the IEEE 1366, there's also another standard 1782 for collecting the information and reporting it. That's important. As I touched on, specifying a criteria for a subset of the circuits to include a worst performing analysis. As I mentioned, looking at maybe 1 to 8% of all the distribution circuits are what we see in a number of the state's requirements. Annual reports on distribution reliability performance, including the worst performing circuits, and a root cause analysis as part of that as well. Often that's done with a rolling 3-year look back so that you can see trend analysis as well as a remediation plan that's proposed in terms of improving and addressing those issues, particularly the systemic issues that may exist. And then, of course, continuing to assess opportunities to improve on both the analysis, particularly as we look at those customer-based metrics. Those have been increasingly introduced in reporting. Those are relatively new beyond the sort of SAIDI, SAFE, MAFE, and CAIDI figures, but rather the additional ones that Miles noted. Those increasingly are being incorporated to have a better sense of the particular impact to customers themselves. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of resilience planning, we start with looking at net threat-based risk assessment, in particular, as was noted, natural, physical, and cyber threat risk. So that's done usually both in a combination of what may be done at the state level and governmental level in terms of threat risk analysis. And then in terms of distribution, that is then downscaled, if you will, to look at what that looks like very locally in terms of both substations and feeder level analysis. So in the case of weather, Usually you have climate studies that are done on a broader scale, say for a region or state or county, and then that gets translated into downscaled weather analysis and some probabilistic assessment of the impact on particular distribution equipment. And that's where that grid and operational impact comes in, is looking at how do we assess the potential, say, for wind speeds over a certain level, let's say 80 mile an hour, 100 mile an hour winds in a particular area, and what that might mean for, let's say, existing utility poles that are rated to withstand 60 mile an hour winds. And so, if we think that we're going to be seeing more frequently winds at 80 and 100 miles an hour then in a particular area, then we should be thinking about what the impact is on critical facilities, vulnerable populations, customers in general, in terms of whether or not we should replace those poles that are rated at 60 miles an hour with poles that are rated at a higher wind speed. That also comes into play with the asset management that I described, because those poles may be scheduled to be replaced based on the life that they are, inspections that were done, and the poles are already in a state where they were going to potentially be replaced. And as a result of this other analysis and looking at the wind loading that may be experienced over a planning horizon, that it may be that they get prioritized to be replaced sooner to address that need on the resilience standpoint. But that also then gives you the opportunity to look at the improvement that it would have had potentially from reliability, since the pole might otherwise have failed just through, for normal conditions, and certainly was going to need to be replaced anyway at some point because of its age and deterioration. So you want to be able to look at all three of those dimensions at the same time so that you can optimize what you're spending your money on in terms of getting the biggest bang for the buck. So that's when we think about vulnerability assessments, and how do we think about the planning horizon, and when do we think about replacing or hardening certain equipment as part of this mitigation plans that get developed. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, we want to be able to look at the overall electric system impact. And here's an example of what Con Edison had in their 2023 grid vulnerabilities assessment. This is just a summary. They had a lot more discussion and detail here, but there were four dimensions that they were looking at: the temperature, flooding, and wind and ice. The temperature here comes into play because of as higher temperatures may be experienced, it has impact on the current power delivery capability of conductor and equipments that might otherwise get overheated. And so this was particularly a concern in areas with underground equipment, as you can see where it says primary or secondary. So you see underground distribution in the table where there was a primary concern, and that was because they have a lot of underground cable in their downtown area in Manhattan, and it could otherwise overheat because they're in these ducts that it doesn't allow for sufficient cooling, and you could get overheating. So these are things that utilities are looking at as we see changes in some of the weather conditions and the like. Also, in their case, they were concerned about increasing sea level rise that was potentially posing some issues for some of their substations, many of which are underground, and potential flooding in lower Manhattan that might impact some of the substations equipment and underground equipment that they have. They're not alone. Other utilities are looking at similar factors, but this also goes to things that have to do with looking at wildfire ignition risk potential with the red flag warning conditions, as well as factors like earthquakes that come into play as well. So there's a whole range of potential issues that natural, physical, and cyber that come into play. And part of this analysis is we're describing looks at various pieces of the parts of the electric system and looking at the particular exposures and vulnerabilities that might exist in this step. Next slide, please. But the other part of this is once we understand what the impact of the electric system is in terms of potential failure points, is understanding the consequences of that failure in terms of impact on critical facilities, essential facilities, vulnerable populations, and customers generally. And as Miles noted, critical facilities are clearly an important part because they support and especially as we're thinking about longer duration outages with major events, critical facilities are an important dimension, not just hospitals and police and fire, but also water and wastewater, telecommunications and shelters are also very important elements. Many states have identified and have criteria around what they determine as critical facilities. And this is very useful if there is such a definition, because it's very useful in the planning process to be much more precise about how to think about addressing that from a distribution planning standpoint. The other is some states have what they call defined as essential facilities as sort of a secondary category, and these are facilities like gas stations, grocery stores, and pharmacies that, uh, when we think about multi-day outages, become really important in terms of being able to sustain the community in terms of their ability to survive. And so these are also factored in many cases in terms of overall system planning, certainly in terms of emergency response, but and local community response efforts. But from an electrical standpoint, on the electric system, there's also factors that come into play here too, including how you might think about community microgrids and so on that might be a factor to consider. Vulnerable populations, and here again, very important. The elderly, people with life support systems, those with disabilities or other medical needs, and of course, low income and rural populations that require specific attention are important to consider when we think about resilience planning in terms of how to restore electric service and the priorities or backup systems that may be necessary to ensure that those folks are able to sustain and through the event. Next slide, please. As we look at plans, increasingly utilities have been incorporating based on requirements that states have been putting forward in terms of what's needed in terms of distribution system plans as a more holistic view. One example is what Michigan has been doing, and both Consumers Energy and Detroit Edison have been submitting plans over the last couple of years that are more comprehensive than previously done. Michigan's not alone. There are other states doing the same, and I encourage you all to take a look at what they're doing and seeing how this might apply to yourselves. In the case of Detroit Edison, their 2023 plan is fairly comprehensive. It's a useful plan to look at. It's fairly long, but there's a lot of good information in there that you might find of use in terms of how you think about implementing and a more integrated planning processing in your own jurisdictions. This is just an example of both their planning objectives that they're very clear about up front in terms of the 5 objectives that they've identified, which align to the state objectives, and then just a short illustration of how they started to look at SAIDI information and weather impacts by census tracts, so starting to kind of zero in particular areas. The next slide shows how they've been looked at from a reliability improvement. So taking a look at some of those weather on a more granular basis, and then starting to overlay what that impact is in the Detroit metro area by looking at what the potential issues are and what the mitigation measures that they think will address those reliability concerns that are related to weather and the other factors that they've assessed in that area. So what they've done in their plan is a really nice sort of start at a high level and then work their way down in a pretty detailed, pretty granular way. And so I would encourage you to take a look at what they've done and see if that is something that would make sense in your jurisdiction to be able to have your utilities report out on. Next slide, please. And I put together a couple of references here for both on reliability and in terms of best practices that states are doing. Here's the reliability, and the next one is on resilience analysis. Next slide. Thank you.
Absolutely outstanding, gentlemen. Thank you. As we noted, if you've got questions, go ahead and type those into the question function. I noticed that Miles has been busy answering some of those questions in writing while we've been watching, so appreciate that. Miles, I'm going to start out with a question for you. And first of all, thank you for explaining the major event day and how that's calculated. I had no idea that there was a mathematical calculation behind that. I didn't understand it. And the fact that some utilities will incorporate that into their indices and others won't. So that was really helpful for me. My question is, the indices that we talked about, do they include both outages from the distribution system and the bulk power system? Unless, of course, they rise above the major event day threshold and would be kicked out. Is it both that are included?
Yes, it does. But as I mentioned before, there are, I mean, 90 to 95% of those are on the distribution side, but they are all included. Yep.
And I will tell you, the reason I asked that, probably a year ago, I was in a meeting with all of the general managers from the electric co-ops in South Dakota. And I've never been in a meeting where there was as much anger in the room as I experienced that day, and I wasn't expecting it. And their message was, we and our linemen and our line women do everything we can, and we'll go out in any kind of weather to keep that distribution system up and running. But now we're facing something we've never faced in the past, and that's the fact that the bulk system may be where the failure is. And that's out of our control. And some of that was in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, where they literally did get shut off and it was out of their control. And so I think increasingly we've got to be looking at that bulk system and making sure that that's providing power 24/7, 365 to those distribution utilities so that they don't have to worry about that. So questions from the Q&A, and here's two that haven't been answered, and I'll just throw this one out. For the highest circuit level SAIDI-SAIFI in the most recent 3 years, does that denote the circuits with the highest SAIDI and SAIFI each year in the past 3 years?
Yes.
Whoever wants to take that.
Yeah, this is Paul. The example I had, it does denote that. So these were the circuits that showed the highest. Well, one was for SAIDI, and then there was a separate table in that in San Diego's report that had for SAIFI as well.
First one we've got here, and this is for either of you. Can either of you elaborate further on how reliability improvements concretely enhance resilience? Essentially, if there is a reliability and resilience Venn diagram, where is the crossover area and how do we reconcile the crossover area productively and accurately? Is there a danger in conflating the concepts too liberally? Great question.
Yeah, well, there is a Venn diagram in concept, starting with asset management, and then tying to reliability and then resilience. And I would think about it in that order because typically with asset management, you're first starting to look at and doing analysis on things like failure rates and predictive sort of analysis on when failure might happen, sort of mean time to failure kind of analysis. And so if you understand that, then that's generally tied to reliability measures. Now, as I mentioned, once you start to look at that, and also the inspection reports that come from polls, you also have a good sense of, do you have exposure, and take polls for example, that they're going to be susceptible to, if they're rated for 60-mile-an-hour winds, and that you're already deteriorated, so it's probably not even going to support a 60-mile-an-hour wind, and yet you're forecasting that you think that you're going to be starting to experience more often 80-mile-an-hour winds, then that you're going to have a resilience problem, not just reliability if it's a major event. So you start with asset and then you migrate into reliability and you start to look at the resilience as well. Because all resilience, I mean, the way that I think about resilience, I don't know if this is helpful, but all resilience events are basically a whole lot of reliability events, right? So the things that fail are the same things, right? A pole falling down, wires coming in, trees hitting wires, but you're doing it on a much bigger scale, right? So, and obviously the forces in play are probably more dramatic, but the same sort of failure points are the same issues, right? Equipment failing. So it's a way to think about starting with asset management, then looking at reliability, and then migrating into the resilience planning from a standpoint. It's not often done exactly like that. Often, each of those analysis are done separately inside of a utility by different engineers. And this is part of the challenge we've had is trying to get those groups to basically talk with each other and think about where the overlap is and starting to optimize what it is that they're proposing in terms of uh, investments to address the needs.
Thank you. And with that, I want to thank our two panelists today for giving us some phenomenal information. Thank you for taking your time. Remind everyone that this has been recorded. This, along with the materials, will be available on the NARUC website. And with that, Hailey, I'll turn it back to you.